First of all, welcome to all our clients and all the folks who have joined us today. We're so excited to have you here. I hope you'll learn not just from us, but from your colleagues and peers in the room. And we have tons of really experienced people who are my colleagues who are peppered inside this group, and they're ready and willing to help you as we think through how to make sure that you maximize some of the credits and opportunities that are in these two bills and on the other areas that we work on. So let's kick this off and talk a little bit about what we came here for, which is to discuss the CHIPS bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, two major pieces of legislation. And Dean, I would say, just sort of kicking this off, you wouldn't have said 6 months ago that Congress was going to be able to pull it together to pass two pieces of legislation as vast and broad as these are. The Inflation Reduction Act has dozens of new tax credits and incentives, spends 700 and some odd, almost $737 billion, almost half of that for credits and incentives. Has some offsets that are going to be important to the audience that we can talk through. And of course, the CHIPS Act, which spends another 70 some odd billion dollars and authorizes another 200 billion on top of that. So why don't you talk a little bit about what the highlights are of that bill?
Well, I think I'm going to let these folks kind of get into the details, but basically from a tax viewpoint, there's one big enchilada. There's just one tax provision in there, and it's about a $24 billion provision that is basically an incentive for manufacturing in the chip space. This is basically the tentpole for how they're trying to encourage it, and it's not only for the chip manufacturers themselves, but also the folks with the equipment for it. So it's a 25% credit. You build a $10 million facility, you're going to get a $2.5 million credit out there. So that's the main one. And what we're trying to kind of leverage, and Dave, you and I were talking about it, Chuck, is how much of that is going to then cover also the suppliers. In other words, well, I'm not building the chip manufacturing plant itself, but I'm building the machine that's going to be building the chips. I'm going to build the conveying belt. You get the idea. That is a little bit kind of to be determined. There's a lot of things we're going to talk about where we're going to need to get guidance from the administration about this bill and the next bill. But that, at least in terms of the tax provision, is the big one. And obviously, these gentlemen can talk to it better than I can. This was all done very much with an eye towards the problems we've had in terms of getting chips here in this country and then also supply chain overseas. But maybe Dave and Chuck.
I just want to follow up on this. This advanced manufacturing tax credit, again, the only credit that is in the CHIPS bill. How big is it? And you sort of began to tease this out. It's not just about building fab plants, because that was the headline for the CHIPS bill, right?
Yeah, so it's $24 billion is the overall thing. That's just over 3 years, so it's a very, very robust
just for this
credit.
one credit.
Yeah, just for this one credit. That's what it's scored at, just for 3 years. And like I said, I think you need to be thinking for your clients, okay, my client may not be building a chip building, but are they going to be building, doing work for the suppliers? And particularly if they're looking at building out on that, and they're saying, okay, I build the machines. I think here'd be an example of something I think you'll be a strong candidate for. If you build the machines that are going to be going into that, and you're like, okay, I need to build a new facility to respond to this, that's a good place to be in. I think that's something that would be a strong candidate for looking at this benefit.
So to be clear, it, again, doesn't have to be bricks and mortar. It can be the equipment that go in the bricks and mortar.
Well,
right?
If you're building that right, exactly. So it's meant to get you kind of tooth to tail through the whole thing as possibilities.
So before we pivot back to the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm going to ask you to give some highlights of that, let's go to Chuck and Dave, anybody else who wants to jump in here. Why don't you outline for the audience, what's the economic landscape right now? What's the business landscape that incentivized Congress to move in a bipartisan fashion to get this done? Again, we wouldn't have expected a big bipartisan majority like that to come together, but the challenges had to be pretty significant for that to happen.
Want me to lead
Dave,
off?
Dave.
Well, I think everybody knows that COVID put all kinds of complications and issues with the supply chain when we were looking to source product from overseas, whether it be pharmaceuticals, toys, clothing, and chips came to the top because you couldn't buy appliances, you couldn't buy cars, you couldn't buy, the iPhone 12 was delayed. iPhone 12 was delayed by a month. So the whole point was, for this bill, it's great news because the U.S. only has about 12% market share in chip manufacturing right now. And when the general
That's down from 30% historically.
37,
37%.
yeah.
Right.
So when you have the general public not being able to buy goods, especially cars, and I think the automotive industry probably elevated it more so than any other industry, that we can't give you heated seats, we can't build cars, we can't manage your infotainment system on cars. So the data goes like this. 50% of all the chips in the world are made by one particular supplier in Taiwan. When you go deeper into that, 25% of their business is Apple. And when the automotive manufacturers, at the beginning of COVID, shut down their factories, the PDA, the personal device people like Apple, Samsung, etc., came and swooped in all that capacity because people were working from home. Well, the automotive industry, the appliance industry, and PDAs came back so much stronger that all that capacity that was allocated for automotive and those other industries didn't exist anymore. The other complicating factor, because when I look at this bill, I'm a manufacturing guy, so what's it going to take me to take that money and actually develop a business or a product that can compete? There's one supplier, one manufacturer of equipment in the world that produces EUV, extreme ultraviolet technology, which is used to make your chips. And they already have big major customers that are consuming all their production capacity for machines. So with this bill hitting, you not only have this increasing demand for chips to begin with, you layer on this incentive of billions of dollars to make them in the States. You could go to this manufacturer in the Netherlands, and I can tell you they're going to say, can't get one next year. And I was fortunate enough to be working with a company in Indianapolis that made just completed 3 of the largest components for these machines that run about $400 million a copy. So the investment tax credit is huge. Because, you talk, 25% of $400 million, that's real money. So I think it's moving in the right direction, but in reality, I think the timing is probably 3 to 4 years out before we really see the impact. That's not bad, because I don't think the equipment manufacturer that I mentioned that has 100% market share in that business could produce the equipment to make the chips anyway. So to Rick's point, having some incentives for US companies to make components that will go into those machines is a critical factor. Because the investment that I saw with the company that I was working with was almost $50 million in machines. Privately held business, unbelievable manufacturing capabilities, and they basically had to have signed contracts before they were willing to invest. So this, in a way, is, I think, a validation to anyone that was thinking about getting into this business. The demand's going to be there because there is no capacity today.
Chuck, can people hear me in the back? Yeah, I said, yeah, that's what I said, yes. But yeah, unfortunate. Very funny, Frank. So the headline here is, again, so much about fabrication plants, and even Dave was addressing this, which is incredibly important given the competitive place that we're in, and given the fact that it's such an important strategic component for our economy. Can you talk about that, about how many different industries rely on this, how growth and sales can be dramatically affected by accessibility to chips, and the difference between sort of what we think of as pretty traditional run-of-the-mill chips and advanced chips?
Yeah. So I echo what Dave was talking about there. Is we have a constraint that is really business crushing. I mean, it's crushing our industry that I work in anyway. So imagine an industry that has about 25% of its materials on back order. And some of the back orders are up to a year right now. So when we do our budgeting, we do our forecasting, we estimate the number of projects that we can complete, it's all tempered by the fact of most every project that we intend to bid on or the ones that we win, there's going to be something that is going to cause us not to generate that revenue when we thought it was. So it's really a problem in our industry. And what's creating the problem, I believe, is that we have a quest on the manufacturing of our technology to make it smaller, faster, brighter, more Gs, more pixels, more of everything. And we don't see a change. We don't see any pause in that quest to have that happen. We have this appetite for miniaturization that created this scarcity of the same chip that everybody is competing for. So multiple industries came together, like the automotive industry. They're taking chips from me, So when cars didn't have all this infotainment or whatever you want to call it, they didn't have the 600 chips that are in a car. 1,200 chips in some cars. One of the key devices that we use is 53 weeks now. Yeah. Centralized hub of many of the control systems for building automation and controls. So when we're sitting out there that long and we're trying to run a business and we got payroll, we got our staff that is highly skilled, and we already have a workplace or the shortage of skilled workers. What we're sitting there looking at is, okay, how am I going to keep my business intact? And then when those products do come, if I lay everybody off, who's going to put that in at that time? So we got this conundrum that we're faced with that for the first time ever, we're really competing with other industries besides just the building automation, the control, the AV,
and
security.
Chuck, talk about, because I think a lot of people think of chips and they think of automotive industry computers. I mean, some estimates put that 90 to 95% of our daily lives are impacted by chips.
Yeah.
So, if you look at around the room, that TV set, this control panel, automation for lights in this room, manufacture of that chair, that table, it impacts everything.
Everything. And think about this, like on our phones, say 10 years ago, we could go back in time and say, whose idea was it to put a camera in every phone? That was a bad idea. Let's not do that. It caused a lot of problems, right? Think of the amount of data storage that camera application on a cell phone is creating with all the data centers, cloud storage, the capacity within your phone. And then we said, okay, let's make it not just an okay camera, let's make it a really good camera. And look what just happened there. We 10x'd our storage, the pixels, everything. So all of that is requiring chipsets that sit out in these data centers where nobody really knows where they're at. So if you could go back in time, have a do-over, think about what we would have done differently in the world of made in America. So my question is for the group here always is, are we willing to pay more to have that label that says made in the USA again? Because that's what it's going to take, because we're at a significant labor disadvantage when we are going to have to compete. Like, we can have all these fancy chip foundries in the United States, but if our labor costs are going to be 2-3 times that of the competitive countries, are we going to be able to sustain that without significant tariffs or without significant incentives? So I don't want to sound negative about any of this, because I'm super excited about this chip bill, but man, I hope we don't mess it up when it comes to the regulations and putting onerous requirements on the companies in the United States that are willing to make that investment. Because we got to sustain this. If we're going to build them, we got to sustain that over time, and we got to be willing to pay a little bit more to get that made in the USA sticker back on our devices again. That's my opinion.
So one of the things in terms of the subsidies for the fab plants would be that applicants are asked to submit plans that speak to community investment, workforce development, a number of other areas. We're going to be talking a little bit later about credits that are specifically tied to prevailing wage and to apprenticeship programs. So one of the things that is relatively new that we're seeing is that there are areas that other federal departments will have significant input on that will impact compliance, right? But I do want to get to workforce, and Dr. Ambrose, I want to ask you about this. There is significant money for STEM education. There's significant money for federal research and development, which to me is a huge validation, bipartisan validation of the importance of research and development for productivity gains, rising standard of living, and overall economic growth. There's $200 billion authorized, but it has to be appropriated for a doubling of the National Science Foundation and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. What does that all mean? You know, will that money, do you think that money will be well spent, and how quickly can that money be absorbed by the federal government to be able to see the outcomes that we're looking for?
Well, mistakes will be made. One of the reasons in the federal government we're often criticized for being bureaucratic is we try to be squeaky clean. We've got these enforcers who keep an eye on us, and most of the things that people think of as bureaucracy are because someone did something wrong. And if you've worked at the city or county level, they don't tend to be as squeaky clean as the feds. And so when I hear concerns about it not being efficient, it's a trade for it being honest and clean. And I think I would rather that anyway. And then we have to make sure things are quick. So it's really on the federal government to make sure this money gets out without being loose about it, right? So we've got to stay clean. We have to do it right. But you mentioned two things that I think are really important. One was the STEM education. I've been looking at the state of Texas STEM forecasts, and I'll be testifying to the Texas House in a couple weeks on some of this research. We're seeing as many as 10 to 15,000 STEM jobs that are going to go unfilled in the state of Texas in this next year, and the projections a decade from now are just geometric growth in that gap. I'm now at a university. I'm looking at my students. They are the ones that are going to go fill these jobs. I've got to get those people out into the workforce efficiently, well-educated, and to go save us from this gap. You think you have a problem getting a chip, getting people, wow, that's a shortage, right? And we are in a very unusual time. We had a blip there, but sustained unemployment at 3.5%. The shortage of workers right now, it's unprecedented, and I think it's possibly at the root of a lot of these problems, that we don't have the liquidity in our workforce right now. It's brittle, right? So we've got to do something to shift a big chunk of our workforce into STEM careers. And it's not just going to be young people. It's tough to hear, but 100 years ago, a guy could learn to use a tool and dine out on that skill his whole career. It might even have been the same tool his dad gave him, right? Today, it's inconceivable. First of all, it's the guy's daughter who's going to be doing it, right? And second, she's going to have to relearn tool after tool after tool in her career to be able to stay with it, right? She's not going to dine out on one tool she learned when she's 18. She's going to have to constantly relearn. So it's not just young people that we've got to turn out into this technologically advanced workforce. We've got to retool ourselves on a fairly regular basis. And I know that sounds scary, but you're doing it. I mean, every time Windows comes out, I think it causes a recession because we can't print, with a new version. But we have to figure it out. We got to learn. We got to adapt. So probably the most important skill in life is the ability to learn new skills. So our workforce has got to stay on this. The second thing you mentioned was federal research investment, also critical. I am worried. I look at the nationwide, the number of graduate students in electrical engineering. Now, these are the people that in a few years will be inventing these next chips. What fraction of the U.S. graduate students are from the United States? In America right now, and all this, it's less than 30% of our grad students are from the U.S. And I don't blame the people from the rest of the world that want to come here and get an education. And my relatives did that. What I blame are, where are the American kids? Why aren't they going into this field? Electrical engineering is awesome. You know, incredibly good jobs right out of college. Where are the American kids that should be applying to get into grad school to learn how to invent these incredible new chips and microelectronics? So if you've got a kid who is maybe going to college in a few years, you know, think about it. This is a career that's central to the kind of the human story of technological advance. You want your family to be a part of this story of the future, and we certainly want America to be.
This is something I hear all the time when I'm on the road talking to businesses, right? It was during the pandemic, obviously, it was some of the government rules and restrictions. But before the pandemic and after the pandemic, I just hear this as the number one and number two issue. You can't grow if you don't have the talent to help you grow.
Yeah, so I have parts on back order to build a robot that are 16 months back ordered. Okay, and that's not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is hiring people.
Let's go back to the Inflation Reduction Act and talk about that a little bit. The highlights of it, again, $380-something billion in tax credits, right? Dozens of tax credits, mostly in the technology, the clean technology space, with the goal to try and get, when President Biden signed the bill, he said, I want to get as close to my goal of getting to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. This doesn't quite get him there, but it gets him a long way there, if it all gets implemented.
Yeah, I won't bore with the green side of it in terms of what it's going to ultimately accomplish. But you're right, very significant tax changes. I guess first to touch on the tax increases that are in there that folks I think are pretty well aware of is that you've got the corporate AMT is back in there. That'll basically, for the moment, it'll hit the Fortune 500, very large companies. I think the outlook is that it particularly will be because of the way the tax structure works. It'll be manufacturing, mining, will be the companies
Big
that are
multinationals.
Yeah, will be the ones that are kind of in the crosshairs on that. That raises over $200 billion over 10 years. It's a big number and raises a significant amount of money.
But big change in terms of the approach, right?
Yeah.
Book versus taxable income.
Well, Kathy and I were talking about this. If you want to discuss this, yeah, I know you all accountants are very thrilled that you're going to now run the tax code as everything's being driven by what your tax run is. So that'll be good times for everyone. But Kathy, I mean, you were talking about this better than I was about kind of the challenges as you see it for folks to do it. And Eric, I don't know if you want to go ahead, Kath.
Yeah, I would say, when you build the AMT off of what the adjusted financial statement income, and so you have your book to tax differences, but now you've got a tax that's built on that. And so you've got some audits. Those of you who do audits obviously are going to be tied up in this with your clients. And then how's this going to look at the end? And so I'm not sure that we have comfort that the tax writers have the knowledge to put this in place the way we might want to see this play out. So obviously your concerns and then comments on any proposed regulations and how this is implemented is going to be important.
Yeah, and the service has decided to, can you hear me? The service has decided to kind of centralize all of these Inflation Reduction Act, proposals into one office so that it can actually ensure that everyone is kind of meeting those obligations. And but overall, especially as you look at the 15% corporate tax rate, there's a thought that looking at some potential fairness, or perception of fairness across the board. So there's been a lot of momentum in regards to having this 15% corporate tax rate. So.
And assuming that this, you can assume that this is where it stops with this one provision, or you can choose not to assume that, and that it could bleed into other areas in the future once this model has been established, right?
And you and I'll talk about the elections and what have you, but I think that's right. I mean, once Congress learns to ride a pony, they like to ride it again.
So it's worth paying attention. It's worth paying attention, even if you're not representing a Fortune 200 company.
And I would say to you just one other thought, and I don't mean this to, I mean, I've been there writing the tax in the committee. This kind of came out of nowhere. This was, there was, I think you all follow the dynamics with Center Mansion, Center Cinema in terms of doing this. This was kind of the lowest common denominator that they could all agree on this, and the other couple provisions we'll talk about. This is really what they could all agree on, and it really kind of started as, well, hey, I've got a napkin, I've got a pen, let's try to do this. It was not, really laid out or vetted or thought through. It kind of was like, well, I don't know, that sounds okay. And it, it was almost kind of one of those things that labeling helped. You're like, oh, minimum tax. Who could be against the minimum tax? That's what motivated. But they didn't really think through the problems you laid on, Kathy. Of okay, well now
A financial statement. But I mean, the common perception in the public is that there are these really large companies not paying any tax.
Yeah, because
I mean, so you see that. So they're taking care of that.
That are already in the code that Congress put in there.
Well, I understand that, but people look at that. So now you've got an AMT that maybe impacts 150 to 200 companies, but as you said, does that bleed somewhere else?
Yeah. And what does it mean in terms of standard setters and the IRS, and how much impact the IRS now will have on the development of
Well, I'm guessing the
financial statement
auditors
standards
are
yeah.
going to be concerned. I mean, you've got the financial statement is going to drive the tax impact.
Right.
I do think this is a watershed moment because you are pulling into the tax system an entirely different system of reporting. What's to say down the road that the government doesn't say, we want to see the audits of all businesses over a certain size, and that basically CPAs all over the country are deputized by the IRS to come up with other numbers. They can, and the administration is very clear on this. They're generous with how they use the language. The Green Book, which had all these different proposals, there was the billionaire tax, which also would have made a huge change in the tax system because it would have taxed unrealized income, the increase in the value of your holdings. But it wasn't even for billionaires. It was called the billionaire tax, but it kicked in at $100 million. So to Dean's point,
Which is what the Dean, Dean's
yeah,
working poor, right?
to Dean's point though, once you jump this rail and you have the financial accountants really administering the tax code or a portion thereof, it can go in a lot of different directions.
Right.
Well, so anyway, yeah, I mean, so just to finish them up then, Rick, to take you through, because I know we got others we want to cover.
Yep.
Then you had the 1% stock buyback.
Right.
That kicked in. That was a $100 billion revenue raiser. Again, it was all these kind of things that could pass muster because they had the 50-50 Senate. It really drove, A, we didn't want a package this big. B, we want to offset the costs. And what can we get everyone to agree on? Really, what can we get Manchin and Sinema to agree on? Because everyone else is just going to have to suck it up and vote for it. So they got that. That raised $100 billion. And then the other one, which I know you all will be happy to talk about at length and what have you, is then they said, well, now we'll really put the cream in the coffee and put in the $80 billion add-on to the IRS, which they project will raise $120 billion net. So it's projected that it'll raise $200 billion. Obviously, the cost of the $80 billion add-on to the IRS was the third way that they raised it, and we'll talk about that more. But
we're going to come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. I mean, that was the third big raise.
I also want to mention
these other ones are kind of just thank you for playing.
But I also mentioned the excess business loss. Because that was not a major revenue raiser, but it could have impact on qualified business income, the 199.
So they pushed that back 2 years. So that was actually a gift to folks. That was something that Sinema asked for. So that actually was helpful for them and for business owners that they did push that back, and that lost about $50 billion in revenue.
Now,
So-
the only thing I'd say about that I have my antenna up on, that was a pay for 199A. And so when that expires at the end,
Yes.
back in 2025, they'll have to come up with a different regime to kind of cover that cost if
Right,
you
well,
want to extend that.
2025 still hangs out there as the end of days for tax,
Right,
right?
right,
That'll
right,
be joy
right.
without end, right?
Right.
So then, yeah, the excise tax is just a don't do that penalty to thou shalt comply. So and the Superfund's the same thing. So those aren't really. But then moving on. So you've got all that. That's the
pay-fors.
Pay-fors, and then what you've got is really a huge number of different tax provisions, and a lot of them are extensions or expansions of current provisions. And I think of them, Rick, kind of. And I know you and I have talked about this. Is those provisions that are trying to encourage clean production, be it wind energy, solar energy, geothermal energy, all these of basically doubling down. And so, you can see it here. Just go through the slides. I mean, you'll see it. All these are ones to just try to encourage and expand what's already been in place in these areas. So you've got those.
And keep in mind that some of these things are not just about the production of energy. It could be a component, blades, for example, for the wind turbines.
Yeah, so you can see it. So there's that side of the house. All the I love solar panels. I love wind blades. I love all that kind of stuff is one piece. Then there's another piece which is more the energy efficiency and both on the commercial side and on the individual side. And this is where I think we work with a number of you on 179D. And so I want to talk about 179D just because it actually, not only do we do it, and I think a lot of you here do it, but also it actually serves as a good window of provisions that then show up again and again and again in different aspects of this that we've talked about. So on the old 179D, the good news is that they amped it up quite a bit. Now it's going to start in at $250, and then if you're really inefficient, it essentially moves you up to $5 per square foot. So it's extremely robust in that
From
way.
$1.80
Yeah,
on the
from
current
$1.80.
law.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, and then it also expands it in terms of who could transfer. As you know, this is again where the bread and butter is of not only just state, local, federal government buildings, but also charities and tribes, tax exempt. So you really, really want to think about that hard. I mean, the easy one we were talking about is you've got NYU, a private university couldn't use it. Now they can use it.
Right.
SUNY Buffalo could always use it because they were, state university. Very good. And then the tribe in New York can use it as well, too.
It's a huge expansion, really.
Yeah.
You think about
it's a very big
yeah.
expansion in terms of the dollars. I think you should be we're looking at it, whether it'll now make sense, particularly with inflation and interest rates going where they are, that your for-profit businesses may be wanting to look at this. It's such a significant dollar savings that historically, as you know, it just has been more of a timing issue, and it just, is it kind of worth the kettle. We're looking at it and considering the numbers. I think you should be talking to your for-profit business owners who are building their own buildings, own their buildings. Does this now make sense for them to look at taking it? But it's a field that hadn't done it. Also, in terms of rehabilitation, or rehabs rather, that is meant to be more generous too. There's a baseline for an older building. It's going to be the energy savings off of that older building. So again, it's a lot of it's still kind of how's it going to work out in the guidance, but it's meant to do that.
Can I just mention one thing about this? And Deval, if you've got some comment, internally we've had some discussions about when we do the modeling for 179D, and as you can see based on this slide, the base is $250 a square foot, but it can go up to $5 a square foot, 10 cents for each percentage increase in the energy efficiency over the ASHRAE standard.
On the kind of the grind side of it is that it is requiring, if you're going to get those high dollars, that the project itself has to meet wage standards. Essentially, this is all kind of Congress speak. What it really means is you need to be paying prevailing wage. Think about kind of the wages standard for a union. I mean, you could speak to this better than I can, Rick, of what this is really translating to.
So
Go
this
ahead.
is a big, and this is actually, I want to open this up to the commissioners and to the business leaders here, because this is a big change in the code as well. The concept of prevailing wage is not new in terms of federal law. The Davis-Bacon Act dates back to 1931, and it requires that prevailing wage gets paid for on buildings that involve federal funding. So it's not new. Prevailing wage is set not by the IRS, but by the Department of Labor, right, Kathy? And it's based on, although it's set at the federal level, it's based on the wages in a particular locality or local area of what not the average, but again, the prevailing wage is for people with similar skills and similar roles. So this is a new provision. When we were talking about credits before, the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, they both have a 80% discount or penalty if you don't have prevailing wage. So very significant. And in this case, again, you see this pop up. So what does this mean in terms of how the service is going to implement this? Yeah,
So
Eric.
I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think this is going to be a heavy lift for the service, as far as from a compliance standpoint. I mean, actually, when you're thinking about it, not only are you going to have to deal with the company, now you're dealing with also their subcontractors and subcontractors after that. And so really the IRS now having to enforce the Department of Labor standard. I mean, I think that is a big challenge for the service kind of going forward. So we'll see how, with the regulations and different things of that nature, how they come out, how the service will kind of interpret this, but it's going to be a pretty heavy lift.
I think it's a good point, Eric, and Kathy, you can chime into it too. I would say to you that the IRS has a tough enough day just enforcing and understanding the tax code. And I don't mean that in a snarky way, but I would tell
Yes,
you
you
that
do.
the IRS really has difficulty, and understandably, if they're like, okay, well now administer somebody else's law.
Exactly.
Like, oh yeah, happy day. So I mean, that's where I think it could be very. And I would say to you all out there, we are very interested in hearing what your clients, we've been talking about this already, and what you're seeing, because we intend to go in, we expect to get guidance out. They have a heavy pressure here to get guidance out quickly, and I don't think it's going to come in the form of regs, it's probably going to just come out in the form of a notice, just like we've had a lot of others. We want to get in there and work it, because I think it's a real tension, to be honest with this, Rick, of, okay, how green is your valley? How green do you really want? Because you could easily write guidance that says, terrific, well, we'll all feel really good, but no one's going to take this because it's a living hell. I mean, they've got to measure and balance. Okay, here's the guidance. Here's our safe harbors. Here's what we're going to require. Here's what we're going to make this effective. Because it is a real challenge to say, well, here's what we want to see. And so we're very keen on hearing from you all and your clients. This is what we think could work. This is what we see in the field. And I think the service will be very open to that, because it's going to be a challenge for them. But I'm Kathy or Rick. Or...
Yeah, but again, I want to go to the industry people too and say, what does this mean in some states like New York or Illinois or Pennsylvania or New Jersey or California? It's probably not going to have, and I would challenge the audience if they have a different view, probably not going to make that much difference, because those projects ordinarily they have to pay high wages just to compete, right? But in other states that don't have prevailing wage, that are right-to-work states, will you see a dichotomy? Will you see that this will be more of a deterrent in certain geographies? What do you think, Dave?
Well, to Dr. Ambrose's point, the lack of skilled labor in the United States is not new news. So when you go into a manufacturing facility, meeting the prevailing wage is a non-issue, because you are competing with all the other manufacturers globally and within your own county, et cetera. So the prevailing wage for skilled labor is not going to be an issue. The apprenticeship program, that's also the other requirement. Because there's a lack of skilled labor, just about every company that has a trade school or availability to get apprentices have apprentices. That's the feedstock. They're the young people that they can influence, keep, understand what they're good at, what they're not good at. And these students many times have multiple job offers, and they tend to go with the companies that give them the apprenticeship.
Mm-hmm.
So the prevailing wage is a non-issue, and where there are schools that provide apprentices, it's a non-issue as well. In other areas where there's no trade schools or the ability to recruit apprentices, it would be a deal breaker.
Right. Chuck?
I have a different opinion on that based on the scope of work that our member companies, the ones that go out and do the implementation of like PoE, LED lighting, things like that. So the system integrator that would do this, they often hire subcontractors to do the installation and stuff. Those people are in and out before anybody can do a certified payroll. So I don't know if your clients do certified payroll on prevailing wage jobs now, but it's really hard in many cases because like the state of Pennsylvania, they haven't updated their SOC codes in over 25 years.
Just one data point. I live in Mississippi, coastal Mississippi. We have the Ingalls shipbuilding yard there. They have 2,000 job openings right now, 2,000. And they all pay what in Mississippi is an excellent wage. So what's being talked about, it's not only for the chip makers, these are for welders and very, in some instances, low-skilled jobs, painters. They've got openings in every category of employment.
Industry by industry, if you're doing global business, if you're selling into different markets, you've got competition, you may be paying more. You guys correct me if I'm wrong, if that's what I'm interpreting.
So 26 states are right-to-work states still, and many of them, like the state I live in, they have project labor agreements, and prevailing wage on many projects is an illegal activity. You can't do a PLA in the state of Iowa legally because we take pride in being a right-to-work state.
Wow.
So we pay what we feel the job is worth, not what the Department of Labor and now the IRS will tell us what we have to pay. So there's going to be a bit of a conflict there, I'm afraid.
This provision shows up again and again and again. In
That's
different
one of the
provisions.
takeaways
That's why we
here.
wanted to make you aware of it. This wasn't just one time. They
Right.
said, oh, well, we'll do this again.
It's in most of the credits,
It's
right?
it's in
That's
most
right.
of the energy credits. And again, just want to go back to the point you made, Kathy, about the compliance risk, right? So if you're just one part of the puzzle, if you're just one contractor, you may have to understand how the other subcontractors or contractors are complying with the law.
Right.
So will the IRS have a safe harbor? Is that something that you think for this to be workable? And again, Eric and Mark and Kathy, can you actually impose this on a taxpayer and have it work without a safe harbor?
No, I mean, I think to Dean's original point, it was like, this is where we need your feedback, and this is where we need your voices in regards to, speaking about this, because there's a lot of nuances here in regards to, Chuck mentioned 26 different states that, right-to-work states. So we need that feedback. So for the IRS, it's going to be challenging for them. It's definitely going to be challenging.
Yeah. What?
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I wanted to go to a different area
Well,
of the
that's what I
bill.
was gonna do.
Yeah,
If we could-
I want to do transferability because
I
I just want to hit
read
like
my
these
mind.
some of these. We're
Yeah.
trying to hit some of these new concepts for you that are in these bills that may not impact you today, but you should keep your eye on because you may see them pop up on other provisions going forward, especially as you think about the TCGA expiring in only a couple of years.
Right. So other than 170ID and a few others, basically one of the other things they did, not only expanding, involving, but anything that was a deduction in general, if it was a credit, it stayed a credit, but if it was a deduction, they tried to move it into a credit, and then they tried to make it transferable. So all these, when you had the earlier slides of the wind credit, the solar credit, the I love this credit, all these credits for building new energy and everything, they are all going to be transferable. And there's kind of two nuances. If you're a government entity or a charity, you can just go get a check. You can just go to the government and say, I did X, send me my money. So they'll just get a check. And then on the other hand, it's a huge market. It's going to be basically created like
It's a high net worth.
low-income
Yeah.
housing.
So for those folks who may not say, listen, I don't have clients that are in this green space. You may have a high net worth client that is going to be interested in buying some of these credits. If there's a regime to sell a credit directly, you don't need a partnership in order to sell the credit. You don't need an LLC. those are two important breaks with the model in the past, like the low-income housing tax credit. There's a structure that's got to be a partnership structure that's got to be created in order for you to sell or monetize the credit. That's not the case with this. And when you sell the credit, the depreciation benefits can stay with the property even if you sell the credit.
Right. So, and there's one other provision that I wanted to highlight for you too. Once again, the transferability is 45L. So what it basically says is for a single home that meets certain energy standards that a builder's built. This is for the builder, not for the owner, but it's not for mom and pop cattle who buy the home, it's for the builder, is $5,000. But this is where I want to make certain too, is that you understand that if I'm building a multi-unit entity, depending on the energy savings, and they've changed how they model it. Now it's basically mimicking 179D on how you've got to model it, is up to $5,000 per unit that you can get. So I have a 100-unit building, $500,000. So I want you to be thinking long and hard about your builders.
Including multifamily, by the way.
Especially including multifamily. And so then one last one that we should get into is the R&D credit. So on the startup provision, they increased it from $250,000 to $500,000 for the startup. It's nice. I mean, it's probably limited how many companies will be able to take advantage of it. Rick and I are talking. I think the real benefit of that is it signaled again, just like you saw it in the CHIP bill, Congress continues to be all in on the importance of R&D. The R&D amortization issue was not addressed in this bill because they're basically holding it as a negotiation for the end-of-year tax bill that we'll get. There was a 90-5 vote in the Senate saying we want to get rid of amortization. We love R&D, essentially. It was a bipartisan vote. It's a bipartisan, bicameral issue that they're very keen on, but it's getting caught up with kind of grander runs. We expect it to be addressed. It'll be seamless going back, just like all the R&D fixes, as you were aware of over the years. It'll go back to the beginning of the year. It could be just a one-year fix. At most, it'll probably be a 3-year fix because they'll want to tie it up to 2025 so it can be part of the general discussion then, but we strongly anticipate that it will be resolved and fixed. But we did get this one change in the R&D. Thanks for reminding me, Kathy, on that, and that's nice for some of your startups.
Just one thing, my takeaway on this is also because you had all 50 Democratic senators in support of this bill that included this R&D provision, it's another validation of the breadth of support for R&D by both Republicans and Democrats. Lots of time people presuppose that it's Republicans drive R&D enhancements, but in this case, you saw the Democratic conference come together, both recognizing the importance of this tax provision for the country's economy and its future pathway. So we're going to go into the IRS now, which is our favorite thing to talk about, right?
The service right now has 200 and something legacy systems. And how does the service define legacy systems? Systems that have been in play for over 25 years. Okay. So you think about that, from an IT perspective, where we have gone for 25 years. So there is a lot that is needed from the service, from, just modernization and different things of that nature. So they have a modernization plan. We'll get into it, but, as far as how do we divvy up the funds, $45 million goes into enforcement. I would have probably put a little bit more into the business modernization pot, because if you look at the IRS strategic plan right now, one of the key components is transformation. And over the next 10 years, think about where we need to be from an IRS perspective as far as transforming our tax administrations. And COVID just amplified that even further, because the IRS started looking for COBOL developers and programmers. I mean, I talked about COBOL in 1984,
So Commissioner, $80 billion, the largest infusion of federal money into the agency in its history, on top of the $13 billion a year that it currently receives. Talk to me about where that money will end up, how it will be spent, and some observations on issues.
Let me try to pull this together first. I want to respond to this point. The technology at the IRS is the only thing that has worked over the last 2 years. if you had a paper return and something required human intervention, it did not get done. The technology, beleaguered as it is, worked. What you have had is a total failure to process anything on paper. That's been the real problem. And that has been, yes, there's an issue with the budgeting, but it's also about the fact that the service went down early and it went down hard. People have not been forced back onto the job and forcibly assigned to process the returns. So, I mean, if you filed a return electronically and they had your banking information and it was within the tolerances, you got your refund real fast, no problem. And they did a great job on all of the cash disbursements for the pandemic. So the technology has worked. And Eric's right, there's going to be a lot more money coming in. Now, the bigger picture, let me back up and go to the bigger picture. One story about where we are. Rahm Emanuel, everybody knows who Rahm is. Rahm was the mayor of Chicago. He's our ambassador in Tokyo now. He was in the House leadership when I was the commissioner. And I didn't know him, and one day a little handwritten note came in saying, "We think you're doing a great job." And so I went to go see him. Why did Rahm Emanuel think I was doing a great job? And he said, "Oh, because we were bringing back the enforcement after the end of the 90s when the country had surpluses, it didn't need the money. We were trying to bring back up the enforcement." And Rahm said, "You're doing great. We want you to bring in the money so that we can spend it." And that was the approach, and that is what's happened now. The administration came in with huge appetites for spending that you've all read about in the trillions and trillions of dollars. But they had the inconvenient reality of Manchin on the one hand, and then Sinema, who said, "You're not going to tinker with the rates." So you end up with this book tax thing we talked about, a couple other little things, but there wasn't going to be a wholesale move to progressivity along the lines that Warren and others would want. You have at the same time, though, the tax gap, which is calibrated periodically by the research group at the IRS. You may have seen a misstep. Jim Comey's audit was selected for this program. So they, little detail, but they do very good, painstakingly detailed work, which I relied on a great deal. It's just slow. It comes in years after the fact. The tax gap says there's hundreds of billions of dollars that should come in, but does not come in. So when the president gave his speech in April of last year, not this year, last year, he said, "We're going to go get more money from the rich. Don't worry about $400,000 and below. I'm not going to increase your taxes." That changed to where tax administration became, and he said in the speech, we're going to get the IRS to go after the big companies and get them to pay their fair share. But the package, as the rates fell out from Sinema, the package became much more oriented towards giving a lot of money to the IRS and tax compliance. That's all great, but as Kathy and Eric will tell you, it's not going to be easy. We've been talking about labor shortages. Oh, bingo, go find 87,000 people to work for who? The IRS? There's a lot of scrutiny of the service right now. You've got Rick Scott in Florida saying, whatever you do, don't go work for the IRS. There's a very politicized environment right now. So it's going to be the service is going to have to proceed extremely carefully. Anything it does will take years to play out because you've got to recruit the people, train them up because they're going to be working on the Wells Fargo tax return or some very complicated international business. That's not easy to just train them up. That's going to take a long time. And again, people are going to be watching it all the time. And the last thing I'll say is this is against the backdrop of an agency that right now has been given largely a pass. Without the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, everything else, if I'd been the commissioner and I had backlogs of tens of millions of pieces of correspondence and returns on process, I would have had Dean Zerbe doing a tap dance on my head every morning. I mean, that's just,
Well, and the fact that you managed to lose 10,000 tax returns to ProPublica to let them publish them.
that's the other piece.
Yeah,
That's the other
magic
piece.
without end. Yeah,
You've got the data security issue and the backlogs. The Congress is losing patience with this. That's the starting point for this bill. So, yes, the money is there. It's good for 9 years. And Dean and Rick will get into this, but it'll take a change in control, basically of the administration as well, to get rid of a lot of that money, as long as you have Biden in the next couple of years.
I'm sorry.
No, that's
Yeah.
but that's it. This is gonna play out over years, and I guess what I would say is echo the same thing Dean said before. As you see issues here, we're going to be commenting on this. We would like to hear from you about what you're seeing in your local markets.
And Rick, just Eric had pointed out to it, it's actually a more troubling thing. Not only do they have to theoretically hire 87,000, Eric, you were talking about.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I mean, to kind of level set a little bit here again, over the last 10 years, the service has lost almost 33,000 employees. Okay, so then now we're over the next 6 years. 50,000 out of the 80,000 are eligible to retire. I'll say that again. 50 out of the 80 are eligible to retire. So if you combine that, pretty much all of the workforce, that institutional knowledge is almost going out the door. So that is a challenge for the service. Now, what is going to be the strategy? The strategy, and of course, everyone in here is trying to do the same thing, is try to recruit entry-level individuals coming out of college, maybe mix it up a little bit, maybe not all accounting majors, look at other majors as well, but also they're going to probably I think they're going to try to institute what is called a rehired annuitants program, in which they will get retired individuals to come on board to
Mark Everson.
Yeah. Mark said
Everson
he'll sign up,
2.0.
right? And to come on board to be instructors, to come on board to be on-the-job trainers, different things of that nature. But it's still going to be a heavy lift, because we've seen over the last year they have not met their hiring expectations or goals.
So IRS tried to hire 10,000 people, some agents, but customer service. If you think about the budget, they got 80 billion. 45.6 is for enforcement. Only 3.2 billion is for taxpayer services. Okay, so they couldn't hire enough people to process the paper. I looked at the numbers today. I think it's 9 million unprocessed 1040s that were filed after January of 2022. 2 million 941s that haven't been processed. Lots of amended returns that haven't been processed because they're paper. They're going to be challenged. So they have the money. It's for 10 years. The appropriations don't pay the pay increases each year, so they couldn't replenish the workforce Eric was talking about, because just other things, salaries, whatever, eat up whatever small increase they got in the budget each year.
What is the percentage of the IRS budget that's spent on salary?
Well, it was 80% when I was there, around 80%.
I just wanted them to understand that.
Right.
I mean, that's the cost.
Yeah,
and it's going up every year.
And it's going up every year. So as to the enforcement funds, it's not all going to be revenue agents. I mean, thank goodness your son is getting an accounting degree, because I understand there's not as many accounting graduates anymore. So IRS revenue agents, I was an agent, I had to have an accounting degree. I mean, I just don't know, once they have to finish 5 years of school for accounting, are they going to want to go to the government to work? I did, but that was a long time ago. Doesn't mean it's the same dynamic driving people for that decision. The other part is it's not all criminal investigators. Maybe what you said, 3,200 is what they're trying to get to, or whatever.
Up from 2,000 to 30.
They need support people. They can't just hire revenue agents. If they don't have support people to handle the notices that get issued, take care of the paperwork, there's counsel folks who have to write legal guidance, assist on cases, and there's appeals officers that have to hear cases that are unagreed, because certainly you don't agree with a lot of these new agents. Those of your CPAs, I'm sure if you've had newer agents come in, you felt like you had to train them, because it takes several years to get up to speed on your job. So there's lots of challenges that are going to come with this $80 billion putting it all in there, ensuring it's used in the right place. And Mark, before we finish, I do want you to maybe comment on the e-file thing that's in there. But anyway, you can see taxpayer services. I mean, your point about technology. They have business systems modernization. That's 4.8 billion. I mean, if you call now, you mailed in something. They got business on one computer system, individual on another computer system. So the level of service when you actually call in now is only 10%. So, I mean, you can keep holding, but the likelihood of getting through is slim to none, is my guess.
So the answer is just
Eric,
don't call.
Eric, well, and can talk about
Problem solved.
what they're trying to move to is self-service systems. If they tell you those are CBAs, you know, they want you to do online accounts. They want you to be able to pull up everything without talking to somebody. Then you can do it 24/7. They have chat bots.
Yeah,
And
Eric.
so Eric, I'll let
you've
you
been good.
go
You
into
talk
that.
about
Wait a minute,
Eric.
there's a deeper question here. If you haven't gotten your refund back, you call not once, you call every week. So until you address these underlying human intervention process flows and get them down to normal levels, you will have an artificially high level of calls that will continue to pollute the system. They've got to get rid of the backlogs, all of it.
I think this is something that Alliant Group, and Eric, I want to turn it over to you, but just real quickly, as we talk to the Congress, and this is again what we want to hear from you, I think this is still, the clay is not formed and set yet on this. I think they need to hear from you. I mean, I would just say from my time doing the oversight on it, it's great that, I get all the thumping and what have you, but you really do need to have service. You need to answer your phones. You need to be responding. People, it does improve compliance mightily to do that. I think the Congress needs to hear from you all, and I'm happy to hear from you all of, what will make a difference, what does happen, what is this? Because this is the chance to, I know AICPA, where you're so active, Kathy, is shouting, but this is your moment to really kind of raise your hand, and we intend to do that Alliant Group to say, look, we get the enforcement part, we understand that, but you really got to make a priority on phone answering services, basic blocking and tackling, really. But Eric, talk us through kind of how they're looking at dealing with it.
When I was at the service, just kind of taxpayer service aspect as far as level of service was roughly 60%. Now, on small business self-employed side, where you had collections, where you had the liens and levies, different things of that nature, that was 30%. And to kind of put it in perspective, so 3 out of 10 people actually got through. So started employing a number of, artificial intelligence, chat box, customer callbacks, which seems kind of basic, to be very honest, but that has helped reduce the demand. So the service has recently piloted a chat box in which they answered 3 million calls in a short period of time. So, and that was only during business hours. So I've had conversations with, service personnel now. They're looking at potentially extending that to longer hours so they can answer some of the basic calls, so which will reduce the demand overall. Now the demand should also go down to some degree because a significant amount of calls, at least last year, related to COVID relief payments, economic impact payments, child tax credit. So some of that should, relieve some of the tension that is there. But there also, and going back to just the hiring point, I'll emphasize consistently, data analytics, data analytics, data analytics. From a service standpoint and from an enforcement standpoint. The service is also looking to hire data scientists, behavioral scientists, and really kind of match those behavioral scientists and data scientists with subject matter experts to develop algorithms to be able to address many of these customer service issues as well as compliance issues. So that's the overall strategy at which they're
because that's the key of getting the IRS smarter, because right now they're what we call no change rate, i.e. audits where there's no change. I know that sounds like a win for you all, but as you know, it's grind and misery for you and your clients of, okay, well, you were here for nothing. It's very high now for the service. It's like 30, 35%.
Yeah.
Meaning an exam, and if you think about it, it's a terrible waste of IRS resources that they're hitting dry holes.
Right. I mean, it's just a waste of your time, waste of your client's time, and then you go through this extensive audit, and then there's no change. I mean, so really trying to reduce that significantly. So with data analytics, and I mean, this is probably one of the highest priorities for the service to really employ a strong data analytics strategy overall, because they recognize you'll never be able to get to the number of resources that you need to address things, so you have to work smarter.
There's been a long, slowly gaining steam movement that the IRS ought to fill out the tax return for most people. This was actually, I think, piloted in California. They gave it a go 15 years ago or so. And the more the service stumbles on blocking and tackling that we're discussing, the closer I think we arrive to that day when the Congress just suddenly acts and says, look, for the assistant manager at the Hilton Garden Inn, you guys fill out his or her return. And to Kathy's point, there is $15 million provided to do a study with a 9-month trigger that says, how would you do this? It's also recognizes frustration with Intuit and some of the other companies that had this initiative that has been sort of a little bit, it's been controversial all the way along. So I think that this is another area where you may have opinions. I always pushed back against this initiative because I felt that if the government says, okay, here's your return, and you know that you've got another $4,000 of income from something on the side, you're going to say, oh, well, I agree with the government. I'm done. So I think it turns it on its head, but I think it may very well be coming.
So let's talk about enforcement, right? A huge amount of the money going into enforcement was a very controversial piece. A number of senators and House members really raising the specter of armed IRS agents and overreach. And in fact, the response by the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was to say that the enforcement would be consistent with President Biden's pledge not to raise taxes on the $400,000 by noting what, Mark?
She said that the audit rates wouldn't go above historic levels. And then the commissioner got into this and said recent historic levels. Why, I have no idea. But
what does that mean? How much
what it
wiggle room
means,
is there?
I was the commissioner, my last full year as commissioner was fiscal year 2006. And the audit coverage for individuals as a whole was 1%. That's 5 times the rate that it was in 2019, which was the last sort of normal year. That leaves the service an awful lot of wiggle room about what is historic levels and bringing rates up way, way, way up. And the other thing is, you go back to this, Secretary Yellen, when this first came up last year, she used as the example, well, if this is why they wanted the banking information, remember the banking requirements. They said, we want that because if you've got $2 million of cash inflows, but you're only reporting $80,000 of income, it might pose a question for us. So this line it's a very broad target, and the question is, who's defining the line, the government or the taxpayer?
So Kathy and Eric, both of you headed the division of small business and self-employed, pass-through entities largely, right? Many of them making under $400,000 in taxable income.
Yeah, but I mean, they have said even in this last year, and now they're clearly saying that the focus is going to be on high wealth taxpayers, which some define as over $400,000 in taxable income, and pass-through entities and multinationals. So if you think about the pass-through entities, I mean, they're going to examine the entity and that stuff is going to flow through. Many of those, the large business division has already been examining those folks. They're going to have over $400,000 in income. That's why they're looking for incentives, credits, et cetera, to lower their tax rate. So I don't think that's going to impact that. The other thing is that correspondence audits or the automated underreporter, when they just do matching, isn't included in the audit rates. That clearly is going to bring in people with less than $400,000 income. They think it's an audit. You get something from the IRS, the normal taxpayer thinks it's an audit. An automated underreporter notice is not an audit in IRS speak. But certainly taxpayers are going to perceive that they are being audited because there are millions of these issued each year.
So, but a lot of these pass-throughs are making over 400,000 that
Right.
will
The-
be subject, right?
Yeah, the
And in
shareholders
addition,
and others.
Mark's point, in absolute terms of how many more audits they could have for people under 400,000, there's lots of room for
lots
the
of room.
IRS. So again, Eric, talk me through from a enforcement standpoint, what should tax professionals anticipate?
So you're going to see, when I was with the service, there was a strong even push for taxpayers over $1 million. So if you think about over $1 million and 10 million, the audit rate for that is 7 to 8%, okay, which is pretty high in some regards. So as Kathy expressed, corporations, pass-throughs, high net worth individuals, I throw cryptocurrency in there as well. Multi-tiered partnerships, I would probably add in there as a focus. So that's going to be, where the IRS is going to direct a lot of their energy. Now, to some degree, they're going to have to reconcile some of their definitions to some degree. So because a high income non-filer is an individual that is over 100,000. Okay, so which is strange, depending on where you live in the country. Say, well, high income non-filer is 100,000, but that is the definition from a collection standpoint. So those are the areas in which they're going to have to do some reconciliation in regards to how do you push forward. So
just real
Okay,
quickly
yeah.
on the politics, because I want to just take 2-3 minutes, because I want to get people to break and everything like that, so on the politics, I think one of the most interesting things is the dogs that didn't bark in this. So we had the rates that were going to be talked about going up, the billionaire tax.
C rates out.
Out, C
right?
rates, yeah.
Individual top rate
Right.
out.
All those, none of that happened because of the very tight Senate. And the question is really, what's going to happen now with the elections? I think in the last 30 days, it's kind of 45 days, it shifted a little bit. I think there was a high view that the Republicans would take the Senate and take the House.
Right.
Now,
Jump ball. I'd
Jump
say,
ball
in
on the
my
Senate.
mind. 50-50, as you all remember, 50-50 in the Senate. More Republicans up than Democrats up this cycle. Lots of Democrats in relatively safe states running for re-election. And the quality of recruitment, and you saw this week Senator McConnell make some comment about how Republicans might be losing, in the midst of losing an opportunity because of the quality of the recruitment of candidates running for the Senate. But as of right now, for me, I would say it's a jump ball. I would say it could go either way, depending on some key states like Wisconsin,
Right.
Pennsylvania,
and I think
Ohio.
a little bit better feeling that on the House. But if the Democrats, and this isn't scary, I mean, this is being reality for you. You may be happy or sad by this. It's not the point. But if they pick up a seat or two, it would make an enormous
Meaning
difference.
Republicans.
The Republicans do. Then
Democrats, yeah. If that's right, because Manchin and
right.
Sinema, if they become less relevant,
Right.
right? They become less of an impediment to push through an agenda.
Yeah.
That changes the dynamic pretty dramatically.
Legitimately, I mean, if the Democrats have a good night, they keep the House, which I think is more unlikely. But if they were to have a good night, keep the House, and pick up a seat or two in the Senate, it will change the dynamics because they will come right back. And
Right.
I don't say it begrudgingly. I mean, the Republicans do it; they do it too. They come right back and say, "Oh, well, we'll monkey see, monkey do. We'll do this again." And then they would go back and look at the rates and other things like that. Because for a lot of the base of the party, this was not even a half a loaf. I mean, they're very unhappy that they didn't get, the whole enchilada.
Yes.
So that would be, I mean, I think that's still to take the House and the Senate or keep the House and Senate is pretty still shaky just because the House looks a little bit better because, people kind of know their individual
Also,
senators.
it's reapportionment also.
Yeah, and reapportionment.
The-
If the Republicans take, if they take both houses, it could have quite an impact. You could have a new, here's a good example. You have a new commissioner. They can sit there on that new commissioner of the IRS and say, okay, here's what we want if we're going to confirm you, they can really start to impact the administration, not only with oversight hearings, but just the simple reality of holding up knobs and saying we want ABC before we do X, and just really grind the sand in it.
So that's the change. If Republicans take the House or the Senate, then they control the committees, and the committees control the investigative arms and the staff, and they can choose where they want to spend their time and where what they want to highlight. What they can't do, as long as President Biden is president, is change these bills. So you're not going to see any reversal for the next couple of years of anything in these bills. Republicans would have to run the House in 2024, meaning they'd have to take the White House and both the House and the Senate to go back and believe me when I say they would revisit these bills if that happened. And keeping in mind that you also have the sunsetting of the individual provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which will also be a interesting opportunity for negotiation.
Right, and that's really what everything's leading up. And just to finish on the IRS, I think it's where it's going to be incumbent upon the IRS if they want to keep, because this is a 10-year funding stream that they've got. If the world's all turned, I think if they, color within lines, emphasize service, emphasize taxpayer rights, which has kind of gotten forgotten, and stay on it. It sounds great. I think the Republicans will kind of move on to other things if it feels like the wheels are falling off, they're not providing service, that they're blah blah blah. They would be perfectly happy to revisit even that.
And if there's overreach in terms of enforcement, you can rest assured that will be a political issue and there'll be hearings.
So Rick and I'll be happy to talk to you about all that, but I just want to give you that feeling for the road ahead. You're exactly right, though, because none of these laws will change. I mean, maybe if something's just seen as completely the wheels are falling off, they might, as part of a negotiation with the administration, say, well, this was a technical problem. But the underlying things aren't going to change. So
before we close, can you just outline for us, Rick, when will we really see this money flow into the economy?
So, the chip piece of it, as you know, Dave, it could take 2 or 3 years these are $10 to $12 billion investments in a fabrication plant. So, that money, and there's a cap of $3 billion, that money could be years away from actually seeing its way into a developer. Most of these credits begin to be effective at the end of January 1st of 23, and you could see that money start to flow very quickly because they're tax credits and they're not dependent on appropriations. The authorized money in the CHIPS Act has to be appropriated, or there has to be a separate vote by Congress to actually dedicate the money or allocate the money for this purpose, and that is at best months away. But the vast majority of the money in these bills is in the credits, and those credits could flow as quickly as tax administration would allow.
So 2024 probably, if it's on a tax return.
Could be 2024, yeah.
I mean,
based on the reality of where we
R&D
are.
credit, I mean, you have to file a tax return. So,
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Again, I want to thank this great panel. I want to offer their talent to you and your clients if you think there's a way for us to be able to serve you. And all of us here at Alliant Group are so very proud to be your business partners. Thanks so much.